Hey everybody, it's Sarah from Zone Company, and I'm here to show you how to stitch a felled seam, all by hand, only with these, no sewing machines. Before we get started, I wanna make sure that you all have the fabric needed to do this. I would recommend getting a piece of fabric that's 12 by 12, so that you have a lot of fabric to work with, or 2 strips of fabric that are already cut that are 6 inches by 12 inches. Or if you're working in metric, I would recommend 2 pieces of fabric that are, let's see here, probably about 30 centimeters by 15 centimeters. Yeah, so then that will give you 2 strips that you can work to hem together. Make sure that you have your thread. I'm using linen thread, wax to wax my thread. I've got sharp needles. These are size 9. You can also use applique needles. You can use milliner's needles, tiny pair of scissors. And if you are cutting your fabric, a pair of nice dressmaker shears. All right, let's get started. This video was intended to be a live on Instagram, but for some reason, technical difficulties arose, and here we are doing a video for YouTube, which honestly is a bit of a silver lining because I meant to film this for YouTube anyway, so why not do it now? All right, so some of you, if it is March 24th or March 25th, some of you might have seen the live where I talked about how to do a running stitch, back stitch, and a hem stitch. And so doing a felled seam is a nice kind of continuation of those skills. If you haven't seen that, no worries. I am planning to film a video, or maybe I've already filmed that video, and you can go back through and watch that. But this is the sample that we did so that we can do hemming, backstitch, running stitch. And all you need to do is practice those and really develop and cultivate your skill so that you have a good foundation so that you can move on and make like the dress of your dream, the pants of your dreams, the shirts of your dreams, the 18th century or early 19th century clothing of your dreams. So all of it starts with this. All of this starts with practice. And I know that that's not very sexy. Like I'm not, it's not very sexy just to be like, hey, sit down with some fabric, needle and thread and practice. But the benefit to it is that practice cultivates a sense of peace and mindfulness, which if you are watching this while we're dealing with the pandemic, can be very calming and very soothing and actually very good for your mental health. And so the practice part of it, though maybe frustrating at first, can be very beneficial. Of course, the caveat to that is unless you have pain in your hands. I know there are some people that struggle with hand sewing because they have chronic pain. And so if you are one of those people, just so you know that I acknowledge you and I know that that is real. There are ways, if you don't struggle with chronic pain, to try and cope with some of the pain you might get from flare-ups with pain. Before I begin, I like to make sure my hands are really relaxed. I like to stretch by taking my other hand and kind of gently pushing down on the top of my fingertips just to give a nice stretch here. I also will stretch my thumb out. I'm not a medical professional, I'm not a physical therapist, but these are stretches that have helped me as it relates to keeping my hands kind of ready to sew. So those are some quick tips when it comes to that. All right, so again, today we're gonna do a felled seam, and there's actually 3 different ways to do a felled seam. You can backstitch the seam together first and then fold over your raw edge. You can do a running back stitch and then fold over it, or you can do a double fell where you fell and you fell. I am going to show you all today how to do a back stitch and fell over. I might show you a running stitch, I'm not sure yet, but this is an example of a felled seam that I did on a dress here, which some of you might have seen me wear before or seen on the internet. This one's actually done with a running stitch and a back stitch, and then this is the felled over. So you can see how it's folded and it's flat. So it's really it's very strong. It's great for wear. For modern clothing, I really like doing this for linen garments. If they're unlined, for 18th century clothing. This is the type of stitch that you're going to do for linen garments, like shifts and shirts. It's also used on other like unlined clothing. For example, like if you're making an unlined gown, you might use that for the body seaming. But yeah, historically speaking, it's used for garments that are going to get a lot of wearing, a lot of washing. And for modern clothing, if you don't have access to a sewing machine, have decided that sewing machines are more trouble than they're worth, then if you're doing unlined clothing, this is a really great stitch, really great seam to do. So let's jump in. I'm just gonna cut this in the middle in case you all created a sample with me. And of course I wanna find where my grain line is. You want to really examine your fabric and think about the straight of grain, the cross grain. So you can see that yarn in the fabric right there. That's gonna be a really nice guideline. So I'm just gonna find one yarn and cut in between, just to make sure that this fabric is two pieces. This is also just a really good exercise when it comes to learning how to cut along the straight of grain or along the cross grain, and just looking at your fabric and manipulating your fabric. I'm using some really awesome shears that are from William Whitley and Sons. These are the dressmaking shears. All right, and voila, two pieces. Now for doing a seam, what I'm going to do is think about what my seam allowance will be. For this type of fabric, I can get away with about 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. So we want to consider that as we're working on this. So let's pretend like this is our right side and this is our right side. So I'm just gonna write this R for right, because this is just a sample piece. So just like if you were sewing a seam on a sewing machine, like a plain seam, we would do right sides to right sides. Now when I'm doing a felled seam, instead of having my two raw edges lining up as it is, I'm actually going to stagger that half the distance of what my seam allowance is going to be. And the reason for that is because when I go ahead and stitch my seam here, that in essence is going to take up the seam allowance on the under portion of the fabric. And then once we're ready to fell it over and fold it and stitch it again on this fabric, that will then take up the other half of the seam allowance, if that makes sense. So this stitch is going to be, this seam is going to be stitched twice. One with your straight stitch, we're going to do a back stitch here, and then one with felling it over. And again, I'm going to do about 1/4 of an inch. So that means that I'm going to do this is going to be about 1/8 of an inch. And we want to make it line up as much as we can along the grain. And the reason why I'm doing a small seam is because I know that I can. If this is a little bit daunting to you, you might decide that, okay, Sarah, you're crazy, I can't do that, and that's fine. Do a 1/2 inch seam allowance. So that would mean that, so again, what I'm doing is I'm laying my top section a little bit away from the edge. The distance between this edge and this edge is half of my seam allowance. So again, I'm doing about 1/8 of an inch seam allowance, so this is gonna be I'm doing 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. So this is gonna be 1/8 of an inch because I'm gonna stitch right here. So go ahead and do that. So if you're doing 1/2 inch, then the distance between your raw edge and this edge is going to be 1/4 of an inch. If you're doing centimeters, then you're gonna do the same idea. It's just a matter of what is your seam allowance? Have that, and that gives you this distance right here. And then that will give you the distance from where your stitching line will be, which will be from this raw edge to the stitching line here. So this raw edge will end up being in between your raw edge and your stitching line. This will make more sense as I get into this. So I know I'm a huge proponent of basting, but for this purpose, we're just gonna pin this first, but I'm gonna pin this about 1 inch away because I wanna make sure I have lots of space for doing my sewing. And I'm using a pin to just gently kind of brush the fabric away from where my stitching is going to be. You might notice I did not cut like the most perfect line, so it's actually fraying a little bit. At a later date, I will teach people how to pull threads, so it's a perfectly straight line. If you all are watching this on March 24th, I am teaching a class, an online workshop, March 26th and 28th, and I will be going into how to pull threads and how to cut on a straight line to make sure that everything is nice and straight. All right, so pinning. Okay, so that looks pretty good to me. It's very important that the grain line of your under piece here is going to match up with the grain line of this. So make sure that the grain line here is continuing on that piece, because we don't want it canted, because then that will create, in this instance, we don't want that. Sometimes on 18th century shifts, you're actually matching up a angled bias piece with a straight piece. And sometimes I like to overpin this when I'm really doing precision sewing, because it keeps everything in place. But this is a really good reason why basting along this line is going to be actually a good idea. So you know what, how about we go ahead and do that? Because some of you may not have watched the other videos, some of you may not know how to baste. Keeping in mind that on this channel currently, I do have a running stitch video. So if you're looking for a tip on how to do a running stitch, that is already posted. It's a relatively short video, and it's like one of the first videos I made. So please excuse if like anything is, I don't know, if the audio is kind of weird. So what I'm doing right now is I'm waxing my linen thread. So this thread has a little bit of fuzziness on it. And so by coating it with wax, it's gonna make those kind of the fuzziness lay down and make it so that the fabric or the thread doesn't actually catch as I'm working. It just makes it a better material to work with. And I'm gonna use, for this one, I'm gonna use a size 9 sharp. I love sharps. They are one of my favorites to work with. I like sharp 9, 10, 11. If I'm doing fine millinery, 11 or 12 sharps is what I like to work with. You also might find applique needles as well. Quilter's needles, those also work. But again, between size 9 and 12. They get finer the larger number you get up. So let me thread my needle. You might notice that I'm needling my thread. I also have another video of how to thread your needle and knot your thread on the channel if you're caught on this step, but this is how I do it. I wet it and then I hold this stable and then I put my needle on top of the thread and pull that through. To knot it, I take where the knot is going to be, and then I sandwich it between the needle and the thread. I wrap it around my needle, I pinch it, and then I pull this up, and voila, we have a magical knot. It's pretty snazzy. You don't always have to knot your thread when you're basting, but it's kind of a good practice. Any opportunity to practice, I would take. So just for the purposes of practice, we're going to baste this first. So when you baste, we're just gonna dip that needle down into the fabric and go forward. I've got my thimble on, so I'm pushing the needle through with that finger. And then we're just gonna dip it down and push it through. And when I'm pushing it, I'm actually pushing it with my whole hand. And these basting stitches can be pretty big. They do not have to be small or delicate. But as I'm working, you can see how I'm just gently dipping, and then actually with my non-dominant hand, I'm actually going to push the fabric down, which is then going to make the point of the needle pop through. Again, pushing with the side here, pinching with my thumb and forefinger, pulling it up, and then actually I use my pinky to deal with the tension. So that's going to create a nice rhythmic way of sewing. No stab stitching here, there's no reason to do that. Just nice, fluid stitching. And you can see I did not do a double thread because there's no need. Historically, you don't typically see that. And if they didn't do it historically and the clothing was strong and lasted for years, we don't need to do that either. So at the end there, I just did a quick back stitch. So I just put my needle back to the last stitch, put it through, and then that locks it in place. And that's something that I often do at the beginning here, is I'll just kind of lock it in place because there's really no need. So when you're doing sewing, just as an aside, small pair of scissors and these shears are going to be an excellent choice. These are made by a company in Sheffield, England, that were making scissors in the 18th century. High quality, excellent, fantastic craftsmanship. You'd be supporting a small business if you bought these. They are a little bit more expensive because of course you're paying skilled craftsmen a living wage, but they definitely are my favorites. So something to think about, something maybe to save up for, something for birthday or for a holiday. So now you see, nice and basted together, no pins in the way, nothing to catch on, which is fantastic. That's always an issue. We don't want things catching because it's obnoxious. So you might notice I had like a little bit of a tail of thread, and I'm gonna throw that away because I don't wanna worry about that. I wanna make sure I have a nice amount of thread to show you all, as like a normal amount that I would cut off as I'm stitching. So the length of my thread is about the length of my arm. You don't want anything longer than that. It will be obnoxious, and it'll be hard for you to control if you do that. All right. So again, needling my thread, not threading my needle. A little bit of a tail. The tail is going to be about 1/3 of the length of your thread. Now we're going to knot it off because we're going to start doing a back stitch. And this back stitch is not the same back stitch I've taught before. This is actually a reverse back stitch because this part of your seam here is actually going to be on the interior of your garment. Because again, right sides together, right? So this is the wrong side. So we want the ugly stitch to be on this side and the nice stitch to be on this side. And this one actually will be visible. All right. So like I said, when I'm doing this stitch, this is the first stitch to actually attach the fabric to begin with. And that's going to be the same distance from this raw edge to this raw edge. That distance right there will indicate how long my distance from this raw edge to my stitching line will be. And from my stitching line to this raw edge, so from stitching line to here will be my total seam allowance. It will make sense once you kind of get going, but I'm breaking it down to different steps, so hopefully this will all make sense. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and put my needle in a stitch width away. And then I'm going to put my needle, jump ahead to the right and put my needle in and go towards that knot just right before the knot starts, because you can see on the underside how that's going to start to make a nice little dash on the right side. That will be nice and even. So in a way, this stitch I think is almost easier because than say a back stitch that's done on the right side, because your thread tells you exactly where to go. You just have to make sure that when you put your stitch in, that you're making sure that you're putting the needle in the same distance, leaving that same distance that you did before. But so I'm putting my needle in, and then it's going back to the thread that I just pulled out to the last stitch. Again, going back. And it's catching just a little bit because of the wax on my linen thread, because there is a little bit of, what's the word I'm looking for? Friction there. But you can see the stitches that I've already done, how there's straight stitches. If you want them to actually touch perfectly, then you would go through the same hole that you already did. You can do that. It's not necessary. This is nice and strong. So people who have embroidered will know this stitch as a stem stitch. It's the same technique in embroidery. And as I'm going, I'm just eyeballing to make sure that my distance that I'm stitching is the same from the stitch line to the raw edge, from the raw edge to the secondary raw edge. If this is hard for you, what I would recommend doing is measuring from this raw edge to this raw edge, and then draw a line there, because that will help you to start to train your eye to be able to eventually do this completely by eye. Part of the thing too is that this thread is ever so slightly too thick for my fabric. It's not too bad, but if I was a beginner, it might be kind of tripping me up, but it's not a problem for me right now. So putting my needle in the same width of the stitch and going back towards the hole that I just made, pulling it with my pinky, snugging that up, not too tight, not too loose, just tight enough that this stitch lays nice and flat. And then I'm going to carry on down the length of this. Something else that hold on one second. Sometimes that happens. Sometimes I pull it and then it just falls out of my hands. Something else I want to mention is, as you're sewing, just like you would do with a stem stitch, I want to leave my tail, in this instance, I'm having it come towards me. And then as I'm stitching, I am just going to the hole that I just made here. And so by keeping your thread towards you, it'll keep it out of your way as you're working. Backstitching requires a lot more thread than anything else because, of course, you're looping back on itself. So I think what I'm going to do is just stitch until I'm done with this piece of thread, and then I will go and show you what I've already sewn and how to turn that into a felled seam. But I would recommend you doing the whole length. If it catches on your fabric, just use your needle and help it lay where it needs to go. Okay, so I think my tail's getting small enough here. So now I'm gonna knot this off. Again, this whole portion is gonna be on the interior. This larger stitch is your basting stitch, that will be taken out. This is what will be visible from your garment. So that's why we're doing this stitch in this reverse fashion. So to do a knot, you can either just go kind of back through this, but I like to actually knot it. So what I'll do is I'll take my needle, put it through the stitching that I've already made, make a little bit of a loop, go through this loop twice, 1 and 2, and pull that knot down. And then I will take my needle and not through the fabric, but just through the stitches, I will stitch perpendicular so that it kind of loops on itself, and then I can trim that off. So, and I've also got a little bit of these little frayed edges, so I'm just gonna snip these because as it relates to the next step, these will be in our way. Again, ideally you really want to pull a thread if you're doing this, if it's going to be on the straight of grain, or you want to make sure you're cutting it as close to the straight as possible, just because it'll make your life easier. So, okay. So there is a, how long did I just sew? That is about 5.5 inches or about 13.5 centimeters that I just stitched. So if I was doing a seam, of course, it would extend all the way to here. So with your practice piece, I would encourage you to do the whole thing just so that you get that practice of lining everything up. It'll take some time, but eventually it will come. A lot of this is just dexterity. So if you're frustrated, put it down, take a deep breath, walk away, and then come back to it. Like, it's okay, really it is. It takes time. Nobody gets this in a day. This requires a lot of just consistent again and again practice. So I know it sounds like a cliche, but if you're trying to hone your hand sewing skills, I would really encourage you to stitch for like 15 minutes a day, just so that your hands kind of get used to it. Something else that I didn't mention when I was doing this is, did you notice how this material is actually parallel to my body? I'm not stitching like this. And the reason I'm not stitching like this is because that tweaks your wrist. It hurts your wrist. But if you can sew more like this, you're actually moving your whole arm until it gets to a really small tail. Then you are going to be using your wrist more. But if you start to feel a little bit of warmth or soreness in your wrist, just stretch, like I was talking about earlier. Just stretch out your wrist and just kind of relax it, shake it out. When you're first learning something, it's easy to get really stressed out and like really kind of tension, hold it with a lot of tension and hold tension in your body. But that's not the goal. You know, the goal is to train our bodies to be the machines, use your body in a way that it was trained to do. So our bodies can act like a machine. Our bodies came before the sewing machine. Remember that. You know, we are very capable with practice. So we are designed to make things with our two hands. So I'm gonna knock this off. Okay, put my thimble back on. If you're having a hard time with thimbles, wear it around the house until you can't feel it anymore. And then eventually it'll feel like second skin. And when you take it off, it'll feel like you're naked. Just like if you ever were a watch wearer and you take your watch off, it feels weird. Same thing with the thimble. Okay, moving on to the next step. We've got our two raw edges. The goal again is to create a flat seam. We're not there yet. Right now we've just got our two right sides together. But the next step is to start the process of turning these raw edges up and starting to encase them. Eventually what's gonna happen is this raw edge is gonna turn up once. We're going to open this and then turn it again so it's flat. Before we do that, to prep for that, the turning of the final portion, I am going to fold this up, and it's linen, so you can kind of just finger press it against this staggered piece of fabric. And for some of you, you want to baste this. So I'm going to go ahead and baste it to show you. So basting it in place. Again, this is temporary. This is using a straight stitch. A smaller straight stitch can actually be used to make this seam. But we're not going to talk about that today, just because for time's sake. Okay, so basted that. Now to actually fell it in place. To fell it, we're going to use the same stitch that we would use to hem a piece of fabric. So on the sampler that I have here, you can see I've done a hem stitch. So this is the same stitch we're gonna do. I'm gonna move this out of the way. All right. Basted it up. Now this is a part that people get really kind of freaked out about. Remember, when it comes to making this flat, because that's the whole purpose, is when a flat seam. You're not gonna fold this up again and stitch it. That's not gonna make a flat seam. That'll make a stitch that looks like a mantua maker seam. That's not what we're doing. Instead, remember, this is your wrong side, this is your right side. We want to open up our right sides, lay the right sides down on the table, in this case, I've got my basting stitches, so I actually want to take out my basting stitches because they're in the way. Okay, so again, right sides, open this up, and then this is folded over. So what I would recommend doing is opening your seam up. You don't need to use an iron, just use your hands, unless this is like a really heavy material and hard to work with. But you can start to just finger press, or if you've got like a bone presser, I would start from where you stitch the seam, hold this open and press it away from you. So that will start to make the seam know which direction it needs to go in. And doing this away from you is helpful, because in this case, what you want to make sure is that this seam is really nice and open. And so you can then go flip it over so the right side is up facing you, and you can then even do this with your fingers. No need for an iron, especially if you're using linen, no problem whatsoever. So here we go. Again, pretend like all of this has been stitched, but for the purposes of time, I only did about half of this. So now we're going to fell this down. It is very important that as you fold this over, your hand that's underneath is pushing that seam open with the middle finger. So kind of press it down with the thumb and then push it with the middle finger kind of away from you. So you can see how it's kind of like moving right there, like a little bit, like a little animal. That's gonna keep it open. It's also extremely important that this grain line that we've established here lines up with the grain line of the textile that you're felling this fold to. So what I'm gonna do now is what's known as felling, which means I'm folding over fabric and I'm stitching it in place. The stitch that I'm using in this instance is known as a felling stitch, but it's the same technique that you would do as a hem stitch. And this is why I'm teaching a hem stitching class on March 26th and 28th, because hemming is the foundation to a lot of hand sewing. Okay, so we're gonna start. I'm going to put my needle just through the fold, just like I would start with hemming, through the fold. Lock that knot in. Push that knot down to the fabric, so now it's hidden. And now I'm just gonna do a felling stitch, or what people know of as a hem stitch, if I'm actually hemming the fabric. This is gonna be visible. This is not a slip stitch, this is not invisible. This is actually seen, but you wanna make sure it's kind of small. So I am going to put my needle in a little bit to the left of where this tail is on the fabric I'm felling this fold over. And then at the same motion, I'm gonna push it through the fold, making sure I only catch about 1 or 2 rows of yarn, because that will create a nice small stitch. And then I'm gonna go ahead and do the same thing. And when I catch this fabric here, I'm not gonna catch it up here. I'm gonna catch it just a little bit below where that fold is going to be sitting, because then that will help to bury the stitch into it. So you can see from the video how that is nice and angled, and that's because I'm putting my needle just to the left, because I'm right-handed. If you're left-handed, it'll be just to the right of the tail, because this is what I'm talking about. This tail is coming out, so I'm just going a little bit over, putting it in the fabric, pushing it through the fold in the same motion, pulling it through, and so that's pushing it down. You see it on the other side. Has a really pretty top stitch on the other side. And as I'm doing this, I just want to remember to keep pushing that seam open with my left hand so that it keeps it open, because otherwise it's going to kind of fold back on itself and the seam won't lay as flat and as nice as you really want it to. Again, I'm stitching parallel to my body. We're not doing this. We're not stitching like this, because that makes your wrist cant and it hurts your wrist. If I'm stitching parallel to me, then I'm going to be using my whole hand and my whole forearm. Remember to keep your hands relaxed. Remember that your left hand and your right hand are working in tandem the whole time. If you start to feel any pain or any over kind of heat or sensation or any twinging, stop, stretch, ice your hands and your wrist, and take a break. There's no reason to feel pain while you're hand sewing, because honestly, this is intended to relieve pain. This is intended to relieve emotional pain, especially during times of stress. Going and doing something that is a consistent, repetitive motion will help to clear your mind. So I'm almost to the end here. And you can see hand sewing doesn't have to be slow. They talk about like the slow stitching movement, and that's really more of a metaphor. The idea of slowing down, connecting to yourself, doesn't have to be physically slow. It can be, but it doesn't have to be. Because historically, of course, these clothing was made by hand, and it was done by people who had to get paid, and the garments had to get out of the shop fast. And so this is going to be like an overkill kind of seam if you're doing something that isn't lined and it needs to be really, really strong. So now I'm at the end, so I'm gonna knot this off. I'm gonna take a stitch. Oops. I'm gonna take a stitch. I'm going to loop through it once or twice. In this case, I just did it once because I ended up catching that last stitch I did, which I didn't really want to do, but it's fine. And now I'm going to go through the fold. Oop, it's catching on itself because there's a lot of thread that kind of got locked in right there. There we go. Pull that through, and then I'm going to snip it. Ta-da! So there's a flat seam. Nice and flat, nice and sturdy. Take out your basting. You can just clip this out. If it's waxed linen thread, it can have a little bit, it's harder to take out because it is waxed. So you may not want to use your linen thread to baste with. You might want to use just some like cheaper thread that you have lying around your house, just for ease and also just to save money. Okay, so there you have it. Flat felled seam. This would be the visible side. I'm sorry, this would be the inside. This is what would be next to your body if you were doing this correctly, in the sense of having a right and a wrong side. And this would be the outside. Now, I will just say this before I go. I like to sew seams like this and wear this on the outside because I want to show people what my hands are capable of, and I want to remind people that clothing is made by a person. Even if it's machine done, there's a person behind the seams, and always remember that. And also take pride of the work that you're doing, and make sure that you respect your own labor and your own process. I hope that this has been helpful to you. I really appreciate you spending time with me to practice and remember what your hands can do. So hopefully I'll see you guys soon.